You're listening to Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We're here on the unceded traditional territory of the Salish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. This is Bernadine Fox, here with my co-host for the week, Glen Grigg, bringing you Both Sides Now. One of the most powerful elements of the therapeutic process is the trust a client develops for their therapist. In fact, some assert without it, healing is hampered. So what happens when that trust is betrayed, and what do we do to safeguard this essential part of healing? This is important information for every mental health consumer in therapy and for every therapist who is working with a client who has experienced trauma at the hands of their former counselor. So get a pen and paper ready. At the end of this show, we will be giving info on where to get more resources on this important topic.
Join us every Monday from 2:30 to 4 p.m. for She Boom. Open your ears to the sound of the latest and greatest women in music. Our show focuses entirely on female artists, from a local to global perspective. Every Monday from 2:30 to 4 p.m., tune in to She Boom on CFRO 100.5 FM Co-op Radio.
This morning we will be talking with Janice, a woman who experienced trauma at the hands of her counselor. We want to talk about why it's important to regulate therapists in BC. Psychiatrists and psychologists are regulated by colleges. Thousands of other counselors are not. Did you know that all one needs to do here to establish themselves as a therapist is to craft a shingle, hang it up, and start seeing clients? At a recent talk with counselors, I did a small 4-question survey. I asked, have you worked with a client who's been traumatized by a prior therapist? Do you know personally someone who's been traumatized in that way? Do you know of a colleague who has transgressed boundaries? Or have you yourself been abused in therapy? By the end of those 4 questions, 95% of the therapists had their hands up. So we need to start talking about how clients might be and are being traumatized by their counselors when boundaries are being transgressed. It's a difficult topic that can strike fear for both mental health consumers and therapists, but it is important to start getting a handle on it, because to not do so leaves mental health consumers in BC vulnerable. Janice, thank you for joining us by phone. You worked with a therapist who ultimately became abusive, and I just thought that perhaps you could tell us a little bit about why you went to therapy. What took you to therapy?
Well, I went for therapy because I had a lot of childhood trauma that I had to deal with. And I had become sober and clean, and I started becoming overwhelmed by all the stuff from my childhood, and I ended up being hospitalized because of that overwhelm. And while I was in the hospital, I met a person who was doing their practicum in art therapy. And doing art as therapy was the most exhilarating and exciting thing I'd ever done in my life. So when I got out of the hospital, I started going to a store that wasn't really a store. Everything was free. The woman who ran that store, she asked her friend, and her friend said she'd be willing to give me 8 sessions of art therapy for $5 a session. Wow. I felt really lucky about that.
So can I ask, you had this trauma in your childhood, and if you, looking back, were there appropriate boundaries being exercised within your family? Did you?
No,
none.
Never.
So you entered therapy not knowing about boundaries, or?
I had terrible boundaries, and one of the things that I had to work on for years was, basic assertiveness, basic boundaries, basic self-care, basic self-affirmation. Really, really tough for me.
Janice, this is Glen chiming in, and would it be fair to say that you were kind of counting on the therapist you went to see to know what the limits are, to know how far to go with other people?
I was like a child, Glen, walking in. I looked up to people who were authorities in the field.
Janice, I think you really got it that we are all, when we need help, in some sense, we're just little kids who have to rely on the good sense of our helpers, whether it's an ambulance attendant or a dentist. And with a therapist, what we're so vulnerable to is our emotions. And one of the things that you've been describing is you were able to invest trust in a helping relationship. And
Oh, yes. Right from the very beginning, she had a very authoritative air about her. And when I found out about her background, I put her on a pedestal because she obviously already was a social worker. She worked at a local college. She had been doing therapy work back in Toronto decades earlier. She was affiliated in some way with major people in the field. And so immediately I just regarded her as a total authority figure. And we never actually really discussed what my goals were. It was mainly just I dove in and started doing art.
uh-huh.
So she didn't ask you what your goals were in therapy?
To my recollection, it was basically just you will have 8 sessions. It's $5 a session. And here's some clay. Here's some poster paint. Here's, let's see what comes out.
How long did you work with her?
From meeting her to the last conversation was 12 years, 12 and a half years.
Wow,
Which
that's
is-
a long time.
It's a very, very long time.
Janice, what started out as 8 sessions became 12 years of pretty regular contact. And
Yeah. And after the 8 sessions were over, she asked me if we could continue for another 3 months, and then another 6 months, and then another year. And then she said she'd like to continue indefinitely with me, and that she would stop charging me the $5 a session if I would have the sessions at my apartment. And so she would come over there and spend several hours each week, sometimes every week, but sometimes it would be a couple of hours, sometimes longer. And she would flatter me. She would bring presents. She
Yeah.
would bring food.
yes.
And it became more and more isolated, where I would be in this art therapy universe with less and less involvement with other people, more and more involvement in this very intense back and forth connection with myself and with her and with the art.
Janice, this is so powerful for all of us, it seems to me, because you're helping us to know that being able to, in a safe environment, examine your inner life is so healing and so supportive. And at the same time, what was going on around you were, little changes. You don't have to spend very much money. We don't really have goals here. Oh, we can meet at your house. This doesn't have to have a beginning and an end. This can go on forever. And those changes happen in such a small, gradual way that there's no one time, I'm guessing, and I want you to talk about this, where there would be this moment where you'd say, well, that's out of line. It would feel like the development of a relationship.
And it would seem seamless. If you've come out of childhood trauma and you didn't have boundaries, then having a relationship with somebody who's showering you with, positive things that you need, and at the same time transgressing boundaries, it just feels normal, but better than what you experienced as a child.
That's right. I had never felt so special, so loved, so valued in my life. And as time went on, she told me more and more how special I was. And she told me she loved me, that she regarded me as her spiritual daughter. I was a member of her family. Even though she didn't have children and her parents were dead, and her brother. But she told me that she kept a photograph of me in her bedroom, a photograph of me in her bathroom. She would send me letters when she'd go on trips, postcards, love you forever, XXX, always lavishing me and flooding me with just incredible quantities of love and admiration, and I was just totally overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
Janice, this is a really painful experience, that you were getting what you needed for a lifetime, at
Yes.
least some of what you needed for a lifetime.
Yes.
And then, of course, that turned out not to be a safe, sheltering, enduring relationship. And
Yes. I eventually told her that I had enough therapy, that I really wanted to move on. And that was the time when she told me that she had left me $250,000 in her will. And number two, that she wanted to buy me a house as a gift for my hard work in my therapy.
I want to say it over and over again, how sorry I am that somebody identifying themselves as a therapist would have treated you in that way, because you got led into a place where those things would sound like they were true. They would sound like the best news you'd ever had in your life.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes it all that much worse
Yeah.
when it all falls apart.
How did
Yeah.
you know it fell apart, Janice? I mean, it sounded like everything was lovely and going along. And so how did you know this was not lovely anymore?
Well, I began to start, being more public about my art. I would take part in shows in the area I lived, and I was meeting new people. I got a new love interest, and as time wore on after I moved, I became more and more uncomfortable with the kind of things she would say to me in her letters and emails, and uncomfortable with this kind of overflowing, ebullient, gushing kind of stuff. And I felt uncomfortable with her asking me the personal questions. I didn't want her asking me questions about my private life anymore. And one day I went to my new doctor that I had, and I said, I feel uncomfortable. Can you help me? I just need to talk to somebody about this. And he said, this is not what therapy is all about. This is not okay. This is a dual relationship. This is really damaging to you. This is keeping you dependent. This is keeping you subservient. This is keeping you this and this and this. So I phoned her up. I told her, no, this doesn't feel right. And I said, I really appreciate all your help, but I feel like I really need to break away from all the different things, all the different hats that you are to me in my life.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like you to just be someone that I owe a debt of gratitude to for helping me in my art therapy process. And she became enraged, and she disowned me on the phone. She told me that because I had proven I didn't trust her, she was taking back the gift of the home. It wasn't a gift anymore, that I'd been pulling on this tit for years. She swore. She ridiculed me. Basically, that was it. In one conversation, my whole life, all the thousands of artworks I'd done, the hope and the faith I felt in myself, that, oh, wow, I am a person, I do matter, everything in my world just collapsed.
Wow.
And I became totally traumatized. In an instant, my whole world just collapsed.
Janice, an experience like that, sometimes even when you talk about it, it's not like remembering it. It's almost like reliving it.
Yes, it was hard when for years, since all this happened, I have wanted to talk about it and have talked about it. I wrote a book about it, Mental Case 101, Trust Issues, TRUSSED.
Yes.
And I wrote it not because on what can happen to one person walking naively into this world of therapy and not knowing anything about what it's supposed to be like. So I always find it triggering. I probably always will. I consider it a miracle that I survived. I tried to end my life at least 3 times. I had no way of surviving what happened. It was a miracle that I survived.
Janice, if I can pick up a thread in your story that's so important for our listeners, which is that you and I know each other somewhat, and one of the things you've been through is just emotional devastation through betrayal of trust.
Yes.
And I want to encourage anyone who's listening to the radio to say, well, why don't we hear these stories? We don't hear these stories because they make us so vulnerable, and we relive that.
Yes. I have to tell you what happened when I started going to see if I could find help, Glen. I talked to the social worker associations. I talked to the art therapy associations, provincial and Canadian. I talked to people in the field, had this naive faith that if I went and told people what happened, they might be able to talk to me about what to do. And everywhere I went, it was like there was nothing behind all the brochures that said they could help, that they could be there for somebody. And I became more and more embittered, cynical, dark in my outlook. And that was the worst part of everything that happened to me, was that I almost lost my spirit. My spirit was almost destroyed through this.
When you knew something had gone wrong, and then you reached out for help, and you found out that those who said they were holding the health brought yet another layer of betrayal, that they said they'd help, but they didn't have the tools to do it.
Yes, because people would say, this is terrible, this is highly unethical. And they said, there's nothing we can do.
Did
this
they say
woman
why
isn't
they
registered? And so it went. People knew that what she was doing was horrible, but she wasn't registered anywhere. There was nowhere I could go, nothing they could do.
Right. So it wasn't that they were offering you help to overcome the trauma of having had this counselor as yours. It was that they had no power over her actions, and in that way they couldn't help you at that point. We need to wrap it up here. Thank you so much, Janice, for coming and chatting with us.
Janice, it's been great to hear from you, and thank you for being so helpful to so many people who have had similar experiences of betrayal and don't know that these stories can be told and that there are people out there working for change.
My pleasure, Glen and Bernadine. Thank you both so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Great having you.
Okay, bye for now.
Bye-bye.
I know it's all you've got to just be strong. And it's a fight just to keep it together. I know you think that you are too far gone, but hope is never lost. Hope is never lost. Hold on, don't let go. Hey, hold on, don't let go. Just stay one step closer, put one foot in front of the other. You'll get through this. Just follow the light in the darkness. You're gonna be okay. I know your heart is heavy from those nights, but just remember that you are a fighter, a fighter. You never know just what tomorrow holds, and you're stronger than you know. You're stronger than you know. Hold on, don't let go. Hey, hold on, don't let go. Just stay one step closer, put one foot in front of the other. You'll get through this. Just follow the light in the darkness. One step closer, put one foot in front of the other. You'll get through this. Just follow the light in the darkness. You're gonna
That was You're Gonna Be Okay by Brian and Jen Johnson. While also a therapist and educator, Glen is also the chair of FACT BC, an organization attempting to ensure competency and regulation of therapists here in BC. So how long has FACT BC been working towards establishing a regulatory body?
We can say that FACT BC goes all the way back to 1997.
Wow.
When we formed as just a task group for counselor regulation, because then, as it is now, anybody could hang out a shingle and call themselves a therapist. But in 2014, we went from being just a committee of many associations to formally incorporating as a federation, because we need to get serious about talking to government about counseling therapy is one profession. It has many specializations, but it's one profession, and the risks of harm are serious. And part of the theme of this program has been it's so difficult to voice a complaint about something so personal, so private, and something that makes you so vulnerable.
And especially when there's nobody to voice that complaint to. So we know that psychologists and psychiatrists are regulated by colleges in the province of BC. What kinds of counselors are not?
No counselors are regulated in BC, except that they work with their associations to set standards and make themselves accountable. The difficulty when associations do that is that they don't have the authority that government has. Associations can't do anything about somebody who steps up and says, well, I'm a therapist, and they do some harm. And as we were listening to Janice earlier, when she went and talked to people, they said, not one of ours, we can't do anything about it.
Right.
Government regulation changes that.
Yes, and like in my case, my therapist was registered with an association, but when I initiated an investigation, she simply resigned, and that effectively quashed the investigation. I'm talking about marriage counselors, family counselors, social workers, massage therapists. What other kinds of counselors are not necessarily regulated in the way that you're trying to set up right now?
Well, within FACT BC, we have a broad range of counselors, and we have the Canadian Professional Counseling Association, the Association of Cooperative Counseling Therapists. When I give this list, I know I'm going to leave somebody out, but we have the music therapists, art therapists, marriage and family therapists, a very big group that has many specialties within it, the BC Association of Clinical Counselors, that includes, as all these groups do, people who work with trauma, people who work with adverse childhood experiences, and who use various modalities to help.
How many unregulated counselors are there in the province of BC right now?
We don't know how many are unregulated, but we do know that more than 5,000 therapists have stepped up to voluntarily pay fees and make themselves accountable to a code of ethics and standard of practice. And the more we've done that, the more we hear stories about from people that we see in therapy who say, I was really seriously harmed by someone who's unregulated. It's anyone's guess, but we know that there are hundreds, if not possibly thousands of people who need to make themselves accountable to a code of ethics and a standard of practice.
And that's what FACT BC is. It's associations and counselor voluntarily coming forward and saying, we need to have our industry regulated, we need competency measurements, we need an ability to make sure the people we see are kept safe from even people who are in our own field. It's a very noble thing for people to do.
Yeah.
So you're right now working with the BC government to create a regulatory body. How's that going? Has there any idea of how much more time it will take before it's established and up and running?
We're very, very pleased to report that Minister Darcy of the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions met with us, and she's assigned senior officials to open up talks about how counseling therapists can contribute to the mental health and addictions work in BC, and how we can contribute to the mission of that ministry.
That's great. So my co-host and I have been talking about the need for regulation with Janice, who has helped us describe how this can occur in therapy and how it impacts on mental health consumers. Thank you both for being here. And Glen, you're going to be back next week as we co-host yet another show.
Thanks for being here, Bernadine.
Mosaic is proud to present the English Language Institute, located off of Commercial Broadway. Are you scared to pick up the phone? Our everyday English class can help. Our experienced teachers give you the listening skills to feel confident chatting in English with anyone, anywhere. For further information, visit mosaicbc.org/MELI, the Mosaic English Language Institute on Commercial Drive.
You've been listening to Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and this is Both Sides Now. As many of you know from my memoir, Coming to Voice, I am a survivor of therapist abuse. This morning, we've talked about the devastation that happens when therapists transgress their ethical boundaries. Now, it's important to say that most counselors in this profession do not behave this way. Knowing the enormous power they hold, they take their commitment to the ethical boundaries quite seriously. And my 4-question survey might indicate that we have a bigger problem than we know, but this is not cause for panic or denial. We just need to plant a red flag and establish safeguards. I also caution you on thinking this problem is limited to unregulated therapists or counselors. We know that some psychologists and psychiatrists, even with all their extensive training, have transgressed their code of conduct in alarming ways. And that usual male-female ratio for perps and victims, well, in this case, you're just going to have to throw those out. One thing is for sure, this is not an isolated problem. And if this has happened to you, you are not alone. I encourage you to reach out for support. So do you have that pen and paper handy? All the information I'm about to give you is available on the Both Sides Now website, which, if you contact me, I will send you the link for to make it easier for you to find. There is an organization in the USA that has provided support for survivors globally since 1989. They are TELL, T-E-L-L, and that stands for the Therapist Exploitation Link Line. There is a local website, abuse-of-power.ca, where you can download a copy of a checklist called Examining Ethical Boundaries in Therapy, which will help you evaluate your healing relationship. Janice's story didn't include inappropriate sexual contact, and while that is a common transgression, you just heard how its absence doesn't necessarily mitigate the profound damage she experienced. If you're a therapist wanting more information about the regulatory body that Glen talked about, you can find that at factbc.org. A truly frightening fact? BC is one of the last provinces in Canada to begin the process of regulating counselors. Both Sides Now also includes a weekly discussion on healthy boundaries. Join us as we go through each one. Remember, you can get all this information by contacting us at bothsidesnow@coopradio.org or via Twitter using @BothSidesNowBC. And as always, if you have questions or feedback about this program and or you want to share your story, we want to hear from you. Drop us a line. We'll be back next week. Until then.